June 22nd, 1986. Roberto Vega had been Argentina's head scout for 3 years when he walked into the Azteca Stadium tunnel and heard 4 English defenders laughing about Diego Maradona's height. They called him a stumpy little bastard. They said he'd crumble under pressure. What Roberto heard next made his blood freeze. "Don't worry about the dwarf," Terry Butcher said. "He'll be crying by halftime." The other 3 defenders nodded. They knew something Roberto didn't. Something that would make those words echo in football history forever. 45 minutes later, Diego Maradona scored the most controversial goal in World Cup history. Then he scored again, the hand of God, the goal of the century. 2 moments that destroyed 4 careers and launched a legend. But what Roberto discovered in that tunnel changed everything he thought he knew about genius, revenge, and the beautiful game. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stadium tunnel reeked of liniment and sweat, but it was the stench of betrayal that made Roberto's stomach turn. He pressed himself against the concrete wall, hidden in the shadows between 2 equipment carts, as the English defenders continued their conversation just meters away. "The fix is in, boys," said Kenny Sansom, his voice barely above a whisper. "$500,000 each when we lose by 2 goals. Make it look good, but not too good." Roberto's notepad slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering against the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the narrow corridor. All 4 defenders spun toward him, their faces twisted with sudden alarm. "Who's there?" Terry Butcher barked, his massive frame blocking the fluorescent light overhead. Roberto held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. One wrong move and he'd be discovered. One wrong breath and everything would unravel. Argentina's World Cup dreams, Diego's destiny, his own career as the national team's most trusted scout. Blood pounded in his ears as heavy footsteps approached his hiding spot. "Probably just a rat," muttered Viv Anderson, but his eyes continued scanning the shadows where Roberto crouched. "Rats have ears," Butcher replied coldly. "Check the corners." The beam of a flashlight swept across the tunnel walls, creeping closer to Roberto's position. He could see the outline of Butcher's boots just inches from where he hid, could smell the defender's cologne mixed with nervous perspiration. His lungs burned as he fought the urge to breathe. Then, mercifully, a whistle echoed from the pitch above. Final warm-ups were ending. The defenders had to move. "Time to go earn our money," Sansom said with a bitter laugh. "Remember, make the little man suffer first, then let him think he's winning. The bookmakers in London are counting on us." Their cleats clicked against concrete as they jogged toward the pitch, leaving Roberto alone with the most devastating secret in football history. He waited until their voices faded completely before emerging from his hiding place, his legs shaking, his scout's jacket soaked with cold sweat. What he'd just heard was impossible. English international defenders, men who'd represented their country with supposed honor, had sold their souls to gambling syndicates. They were going to throw the quarterfinal against Argentina, but not before psychologically torturing Diego first. The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculation. Roberto's mind raced as he climbed the tunnel stairs toward the Argentine bench. Should he tell the coaching staff, alert team management, contact FIFA officials? Each option seemed more dangerous than the last. Who could he trust? How high did this conspiracy reach? As he emerged into the blazing Mexican sun, Roberto spotted Diego warming up near the corner flag, his slight frame moving with that otherworldly grace that had mesmerized football fans worldwide. The young genius looked focused, determined, completely unaware that 4 men were plotting his psychological destruction before their inevitable surrender. Or was he unaware? Roberto watched Diego's warm-up routine more carefully now, noting details he'd somehow missed before. The way Diego's eyes tracked the English defenders during their stretching, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when Terry Butcher shouted instructions to his teammates, the almost imperceptible nod Diego gave when he caught sight of Roberto emerging from the tunnel. A chill ran down Roberto's spine that had nothing to do with the stadium's air conditioning. What if Diego knew? What if Argentina's golden boy had somehow learned about the fix and was planning something of his own? Roberto had been scouting talent for 15 years, had discovered dozens of players who'd gone on to professional careers, but he'd never encountered a mind like Diego's. The young man saw patterns where others saw chaos, anticipated moves 3 steps ahead of everyone else on the pitch. If anyone could turn a fixed match into a weapon, it would be Diego Maradona. The stadium speakers crackled to life, announcing the teams. 114,000 spectators rose to their feet as players lined up in the tunnel below. Roberto found himself studying Diego's face as the television cameras panned across the Argentine squad. There, just for a fraction of a second, he saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Not nervousness, not determination, calculation, cold, brilliant calculation. Roberto's hands trembled as he opened his scout's notebook to a fresh page. Whatever was about to unfold on that pitch, he needed to document every detail. History was about to be made, but not the kind anyone expected. The English defenders thought they were puppeteers pulling strings, but Roberto was beginning to suspect they were about to become pawns in a game far more complex than any of them could imagine. As the teams took the field, Roberto realized he was no longer just a scout observing a football match. He had become the sole witness to what might be the most elaborate act of sporting revenge ever conceived. The question that terrified him most wasn't whether Diego knew about the conspiracy. The question was, what did Diego plan to do about it? If this story has captured your imagination and you want to uncover the shocking truth behind football's greatest mystery, hit that subscribe button now. Tomorrow's chapter reveals the first move in Diego's masterful game of chess, and it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the beautiful game. The whistle pierced the Mexico City air, sharp and final. As the teams jogged onto the Azteca pitch, Roberto Vega felt the weight of 37 years collapse onto his shoulders like a landslide. He closed his scout's notebook, the same leather-bound journal he'd carried that day, and pressed his palms against his tired eyes. The cramped Buenos Aires apartment around him seemed to shrink further in the afternoon heat. Peeling wallpaper curled at the edges where moisture had seeped through from his upstairs neighbor's leaking pipes. The smell of empanadas from the bakery below mixed with the musty odor of old newspapers and regret. He'd been reliving that moment again, as he did every June 22nd, the anniversary of the match that had changed everything. Roberto's arthritic fingers traced the faded ink on the notebook's final entry from that day. Diego knew. God help me, he knew everything. The words had haunted him for decades, growing heavier with each passing year, each sleepless night, each moment he'd chosen silence over truth. A photograph sat on the rickety wooden table beside his chair. Him and his daughter Carmen at her university graduation, both of them beaming, her arm wrapped around his shoulders. She'd been so proud of him then, calling him Papa, the famous scout who discovered legends. That was before the drinking started, before the nightmares, before she learned that her hero father was nothing more than a coward who'd watched history unfold and done nothing to stop it. The phone rang, startling him from his reverie. Roberto let it ring 3 times before answering, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Papa?" Carmen's voice carried that familiar note of careful concern. "I was just checking on you. I know what day it is." Roberto's throat tightened. Even now at 35, Carmen remembered the anniversary of his greatest failure. She'd learned early that certain dates required delicate handling, that her father would disappear into himself on June 22nd, September 15th, the day Diego died, and December 3rd, his own birthday, when the guilt felt most suffocating. "I'm fine, mi amor," he lied, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight streaming through his single window. The building across the street blocked most of the light, leaving his apartment in perpetual twilight. "Have you eaten today?" Roberto glanced at the untouched piece of bread on his counter, the cup of cold mate beside his chair. Of course. Carmen's sigh was barely audible, but he caught it. She was a doctor now, pediatric cardiology, saving children's hearts while her father's continued to break a little more each day. He'd missed her graduation from medical school, too drunk to trust himself in public. She'd forgiven him, as she always did, but forgiveness felt worse than anger. "I could come by after work," she offered. "Bring some of those facturas you like from—" "No need, Carmen. I'm just tired." Another silence. Roberto knew she was calculating whether to push harder, weighing her worry against his stubborn pride. She'd inherited his ability to read people, to see beneath surfaces. It made her an excellent doctor and a dangerous daughter. Okay, Papa, but I'm calling tomorrow. After she hung up, Roberto sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of Buenos Aires settling into evening. Children shouted in the courtyard below, their mothers calling them in for dinner. Somewhere a radio played tango music, the melancholy notes drifting through his thin walls. Normal life, continuing around him while he remained frozen in a stadium tunnel in 1986. He'd lost everything piece by piece after that day. His position with the national team first, when the drinking became impossible to hide. His wife Elena next, who couldn't understand why her husband had turned into a stranger overnight, why he screamed Diego's name in his sleep and flinched at every mention of the World Cup. Finally, his self-respect, sold off one bottle at a time until nothing remained but an old man with secrets that grew heavier each year. Roberto opened the notebook again, his trembling fingers finding the page he'd read 1,000 times. His careful handwriting documented every detail, the defender's conversation, the money promised, Diego's calculated expression. Evidence of the greatest conspiracy in football history, witnessed by a man too broken to ever speak it aloud. What haunted him most wasn't the corruption itself. Football had always been dirty around the edges. It was the certainty that Diego had somehow orchestrated it all, had used the English defenders' greed and cruelty as instruments in a symphony of revenge so beautiful and terrible that Roberto still couldn't fully comprehend its scope. The notebook's final pages remained blank, waiting for an ending Roberto had never found the courage to write. In his darkest moments he wondered if his silence had made him complicit in something magnificent or monstrous. Perhaps both. As night settled over Buenos Aires, Roberto closed the notebook and placed it gently on the table beside Carmen's photograph. Tomorrow would bring another day of carrying his secret, another 24 hours of choosing protection over truth. He didn't know that tomorrow would also bring a stranger with questions that would finally force him to choose between the legend he'd helped preserve and the truth that might destroy everything he'd spent 37 years protecting. These questions. The knock came at 8:47 in the morning, 3 sharp raps that shattered Roberto's uneasy sleep like gunshots. He jolted upright in his narrow bed, his heart hammering with the same panic he'd felt in that stadium tunnel decades ago. Nobody visited anymore. Carmen called first, always. The building superintendent had stopped bothering him about overdue maintenance fees months ago. Roberto shuffled to the door in his undershirt and worn pajama bottoms, his bare feet cold against the cracked linoleum. Through the peephole he saw a woman in her early 30s, auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, holding a leather portfolio and a recording device. She wore the kind of expensive clothes that didn't belong in his neighborhood. Pressed slacks, a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than his monthly pension. "Senor Vega?" Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place immediately. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a documentary filmmaker from London. I'd like to speak with you about Diego Maradona." Roberto's blood turned to ice water. He pressed his forehead against the door, closing his eyes, willing her to disappear. 37 years of anonymity, of careful invisibility, and now this. How had she found him? He'd changed addresses 4 times since leaving the national team, had deliberately faded into Buenos Aires's vast anonymity. "Senor Vega, I know you're there. I also know what you witnessed in the Azteca Stadium tunnel on June 22, 1986. The words hit Roberto like physical blows. His legs nearly gave out, forcing him to grip the door handle for support. She couldn't know. Nobody knew except him and the English defenders, and 3 of them were dead now. Terry Butcher had died of a heart attack in 2019. Viv Anderson, cancer in 2021. Only Kenny Sansom remained alive, and last Roberto had heard, the man was lost in alcoholism and dementia in some English care facility. "Please, Senor Vega, I have documents I think you need to see." Against every instinct screaming at him to stay silent, Roberto turned the 3 deadbolts he'd installed after Elena left. The door opened to reveal Sarah Mitchell up close, intelligent green eyes, the kind of focused intensity Roberto recognized in journalists and prosecutors. She looked at him with a mixture of professional curiosity and something else. "Sympathy? May I come in?" Roberto stepped aside wordlessly, watching as she took in his shabby apartment with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading environments. Her gaze lingered on Carmen's photograph, the scout's notebook on the table, the empty mate cup that testified to his sleepless night. Sarah settled into the room's only decent chair and opened her portfolio. "I've been researching a documentary about match fixing in international football. 3 months ago, MI6 declassified a cache of files from the 1980s. Most were routine intelligence gathering, but one folder contained something extraordinary." She pulled out a manila envelope marked with official British government seals. Roberto's hands shook as he accepted it, his mind reeling. British intelligence? How deep had the conspiracy gone? "The file documents Operation Goalkeeper," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "A plan to manipulate the 1986 World Cup quarterfinal between England and Argentina. Not to ensure England won, to ensure they lost in a specific way that would maximize gambling profits for a syndicate with connections to British intelligence funding." Roberto's vision blurred. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in his arthritic hands, heavier than his notebook, heavier than 37 years of silence. This was the moment he'd feared and secretly longed for, the day his secret would finally surface. According to these files, 4 England defenders were paid to throw the match. But there's more, Señor Vega. The documents suggest that Argentine intelligence knew about the operation, that Maradona himself was briefed on the conspiracy before the match. No. The word escaped Roberto's lips like a prayer. "That's impossible." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "Is it? You were there, Señor Vega. You were the scout who discovered the conversation in the tunnel. Your name appears in the MI6 files as Asset V-23, an unintended witness whose silence was considered crucial to the operation's success." Roberto's world tilted sideways. Asset V-23. They'd known about him all along. His years of hiding, of drinking himself into oblivion, of choosing silence. It had all been orchestrated. He'd been as much a pawn as the English defenders. "What do you want from me?" His voice came out as a whisper. Sarah's expression softened. "The truth, Señor Vega. Diego Maradona is gone. The other witnesses are dead or incapacitated. You're the only person left who can tell the world what really happened that day. The only one who can reveal how the greatest match in football history was actually the most elaborate revenge plot ever conceived." The notebook seemed to glow on the table beside them, 37 years of carefully guarded secrets suddenly visible to someone else for the first time. Roberto realized that Sarah Mitchell hadn't just brought questions about the past. She'd brought the end of his old life and the terrifying beginning of something he couldn't yet imagine. Roberto stared at the MI6 files scattered across his small table, the official seals and classified stamps, making the documents look like artifacts from another world. Asset V-23, the designation burned in his mind, transforming every memory of that day into a grotesque puppet show where he'd been dancing on invisible strings. "I need you to leave." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "Please, just take your files and go." Sarah remained perfectly still in his chair, her green eyes studying his face with the patience of someone accustomed to extracting secrets from unwilling sources. "I understand this is overwhelming." "You understand nothing." Roberto's voice cracked like old leather. He lurched toward the door, yanking it open so violently the hinges groaned in protest. 37 years I've kept quiet. 37 years of keeping that poison locked away, and you walk in here with your documents and your recording device, thinking you can just... Señor Vega. Sarah's tone carried a warning now. Other people know about these files. If you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Roberto's hand trembled on the door handle as the implications crashed over him. His carefully constructed anonymity was already shattered. The secret he'd protected with his marriage, his career, his relationship with Carmen, it was all bleeding out into the world whether he participated or not. After Sarah left, promising to return tomorrow, Roberto sat in his chair and tried to convince himself that ignoring her would make everything disappear. He'd become an expert at self-deception over the decades. But as the afternoon wore on, his apartment began to feel like a trap instead of a sanctuary. At 4 o'clock, his phone rang. Roberto almost didn't answer. Carmen never called during her shift at the hospital. The voice on the other end made his blood freeze. Roberto? Roberto Vega? The accent was unmistakably English, but the voice was wrong somehow, slurred, uncertain. This is Kenny Sansom. Do you remember me? Kenny Sansom, the left back from that tunnel conversation, the one who'd laughed about making Diego suffer. Roberto had thought the man was lost to dementia, but here he was, calling from across an ocean. I don't know what you're talking about. Roberto's automatic response after decades of deflection. The filmmaker, Kenny continued, his words slightly disconnected. Sarah Mitchell. She visited me yesterday at the care home, showed me the files. My God, Roberto, they have everything. Every detail. A long pause filled with labored breathing. She said you were there, in the tunnel, that you heard us talking. Roberto's grip tightened on the phone. Kenny, I'm dying, Roberto. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact. Cancer. 6 weeks, maybe 8. The doctors, they don't know I still have good days. Days when my mind works properly. Another pause. But the others, Terry and Viv, they died without saying anything. Without making it right. Making what? Kenny's laugh was bitter and broken. You know what we did. What we were paid to do. But Roberto, listen to me. We were the idiots in that story. Diego, Christ, that little bastard played us like violins. We thought we were throwing a match, but he turned our corruption into his masterpiece. We helped create the greatest individual performance in football history. Roberto's knees gave out. He slumped against the wall, the phone pressed to his ear like a lifeline. What are you saying? I'm saying Diego knew, Roberto. Somehow he knew about the money, about our orders to let him win after we'd broken his spirit, and instead of stopping it, he used it. He turned our psychological warfare back on us, made fools of us in front of the whole world. That first goal, the hand of God, that wasn't just cheating. That was him telling us he could win without our permission. Roberto's vision blurred. The apartment walls seemed to be closing in, the weight of decades pressing down on his chest. Why are you telling me this? 'Cause they're going to use the files to destroy Diego's legacy. The documentary, the news stories that will follow. They'll make it look like his greatest triumph was built on corruption, but we were the corrupt ones, Roberto. Diego was brilliant enough to turn our sin into his salvation. The line went quiet, except for Kenny's ragged breathing. Roberto could hear machines beeping in the background, the distant murmur of nurses making rounds. I can't help her, Roberto whispered. I can't tell that story. Then don't tell her story, Kenny said. Tell Diego's. Tell the truth about what really happened. Because if you don't, Roberto, if you let them paint Diego as part of the conspiracy instead of its victim, then we'll have finally won. 37 years later, we'll have finally broken the little magician. The line went dead. Roberto let the phone fall from his nerveless fingers, staring at the MI6 files scattered across his table. Outside, Buenos Aires continued its evening routine, unaware that the greatest secret in football history was about to surface whether he wanted it to or not. For the first time in 37 years, Roberto Vega realized that his silence might be a greater betrayal than his speech.